So thanks very much, everyone, for coming to our last seminar of the 2023-2024 academic year. If I could just remind you to please keep your microphones off during the paper and ideally your camera as well, but you're free to turn your camera back on after Diego finishes his paper for the Q&A and discussion. So, here to ensure that we see the academic year out with a big bang is Diego Molina, who I think probably is well known to many of you. Diego originally trained as a botanist in Colombia, where he took part in scientific explorations, species discovery, which I said before I think makes him a bit of a modern-day plant hunter, although he assures me that he's never been involved in smuggling rare orchids or other botanical contraband into the UK. But he was also involved in designing public policy around plant conservation in Colombia. His interest in understanding the changing relationships between people and plants then led to a PhD in human geography at Reading, for which he studied the construction of gardens and promenades in Colombia in the 19th century. Most of his research, or all of it, I think, is focused on Colombia in the 19th century. Before becoming a British Academy Fellow at Royal Holloway, he was a Rachel Carson Fellow in Munich. His 2015 book, it was listed as a must-read by the Natures of Cities platform. It's actually in Spanish, but I'm going to give you the English translation of the title. The book is called Trees Arriving in the City, The Modernization Process and the Landscape Transformation in Medellin, 1890 to 1950. And his new book is called Planting a City in the Tropical Andes and is due out this coming October with Routledge. So the history of gardens and plants in Colombia in the 19th century has been understudied, and Diego is making robust efforts on multiple fronts to rectify that. Amongst his many live projects, he's currently writing a paper on the last British explorer in Colombia, and separately, he's looking at the relationship between photography and plants in tropical environments in Colombia, specifically parallels in how photography and photosynthesis make use of light. And some of you have probably heard the really interesting paper he gave to the London group of historical geographers back in January on herbaria as places of and with memory, which was also a personal reflection of an historian's first encounter with this very particular form of archive. If any of you missed that, there's a sound-only recording of that presentation under the podcast section of the IHR website, and I actually found it really, really, really gripping. It's more of a sort of a personal reflection, but it's so interesting. I really suggest that you have a listen to that on the IHR podcast section. So without further ado, Diego, over to you.
Thank you, Sherizad, for the presentation, for inviting me, and thank you to Pippa, although she's not here, but she was the first contact I had with you. So so today my presentation is like an ongoing project, and what I'm to present to you today is a kind of a preliminary findings and reflections about this ornamental exchange, the 19th century green spaces in England and in the Andes. So I would like to start with this image. Many of you might recognize this. This is the 1851 Great Exhibition in London. This was the place where all the industrial nations exhibited the big advantages of technology and show how the consolidation of capitalism was taking place by mid-19th century. But more important for me than this, of course, this was very important, is the case that this event took place in a greenhouse, the Crystal Palace, that many of you might know, was the biggest building built using glass in the world. And it was possible because a series of coincidences, such as the reduction of taxes in glass production, but also the innovation in the creation of iron. Importantly, this big, enormous greenhouse was created or was designed by Joseph Paxton in 1851, inspired in the Victoria Regia, now Victoria Boliviana. So we start to see kind of a confluence here between the world of plants and commerce, horticulture, domestication. There is a confluence here that it's what is leading me to explore or showing this exploration I'm doing of plants and trade and mobility of plants. So this big crystal palace was not the first one. Before, some years earlier, we have the Palm House at Kew that had been kind of a revolutionary and became one of the most visited attractions in the UK. So London was the center of the British Empire, and then we start to see places where plants from abroad, from different places, parts of the world, tropical environment, mountains, dry areas, could survive in the, let's say, not very friendly weather of the UK. So the British Empire, with this network of commerce and trade and in political influence, start to bring plants to London, to the centers of power, to Edinburgh, Manchester, Liverpool, the ports. And this was mainly possible because of the Warden case, an invasion of Nathaniel Guard in the 1820s, 1830s, that allowed many people, especially in botanic gardens, to move plants, alive plants, with a high rate of survival in the transport of plants. But why they were introducing plants, or why the plants start to become so important? Of course, we have rubber, coffee, and other plants that were kind of very important in terms of in economic terms. But why, to explain why ornamental plants for decoration, for ornamentation became so important, we need to understand that the 19th century was the end of this time of revolutions. We see a century of romanticism. Nation states were in process of being created. The old structure was collapsing. People moved to the cities. Cities grew in both sides of the Atlantic, in America, in Europe. Paris was deeply transformed by Haussmann. So people in general start to have this feeling of the lost paradise, the people that move to the cities, they start to have kind of this nostalgia for the countryside, the nature. And that is in that point with plants, especially ornamental plants, start to have very important key role as members of the urban life. So we create parks in France, in all the parts, especially in Europe. And there is an integration with plants, with flowering plants within the culture. And then we have a lot of literature, like novels, the small tales, and books like The Language of Flowers. That was iconic because it was a way of creating like a hidden language using different kind of plants. So people in general, but particularly the bourgeois, this sector, the emerging bourgeois people, start to begin to get plants. So the plants became elements that could be integrated into the international market, the trade networks that the UK had built in its expansion, imperialistic expansion. So people, for the first time, let's say normal people, could buy plants coming from abroad. So there is a market. And then what happened there is the big players, big nurseries that had been like growing slowly since late 18th century, seized this opportunity. So, and then start growing massively. And we had different kind of a handful of players like Carters, Bates, Bulls, that saw the opportunity, and then is in this point when the plant hunter, which is a term that we need to take with like a pinch of salt, but this figure emerged, this historical figure emerged, but these nurseries. So they were kind of people, like different kind of people, many of them trained in botany, some others not that much. But in general, what they were doing was to go for the tropical environments in Latin America, but also in India, in Indonesia, in Java, and mainly in the colonies, and introduce a large set of plants. In the particular case of tropical Andes, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Panama, all these mega diverse region, which I'm studying, we had quite diverse and significant a group of people. Many of them were Germans, because the UK, especially London, the Kew, had a very particular relationship with German botanists. And many of them traveled there, and they stay a couple of months. Some others stay longer, and some others actually moved there. And including only one really like a woman, which was the Princess Teresa de Baviera. So basically, what they say they did was like going into the wilderness, this forest, these green spaces, and trying to collect the plants, which basically was not necessarily true. They rely on local knowledge, but not only local knowledge, but also knowledge from Englishmen that have been open like the path in their search for minerals. So plant hunters, in many instances, were follow other Europeans, Germans, or Brits that had arrived there first. In any case, they left, some of them wrote kind of the archetypical 19th century travel-ages, in which they portrayed themselves as a quite heroic figures going to the wilderness and facing perils like jaguars, crocodiles, wasps. It's interesting because in many instances they not recognize the work of local people and the people that precede them there in the very remote locations. One of the most well-known, and many people know this book, is the Orchid Hunter by Albert Millikan, in which he allows us to see the extractivist process, the extractivism involved in the collection of plants. Here is more related to orchids, but I have to say that orchids were not, although were the main kind of plants, they were not the only ones. Actually, many other plants traveled. But in the particular case of orchids, Albert Millikan mentioned how to obtain 10,000 plants, they have to cut about 4,000 trees. So imagine if these people was going there, and one plant hunter was going after the other, after the other, after the other. So the disturbance of the forest was quite significant. But in the eyes of Millikan, because of the forest was recovering very fast. We need to think that we are in a tropical environment where the ecological succession is faster than in temperate forests. So to the eyes of the Europeans, they cut the trees, but it was nothing because, as he mentioned, the trees just basically recover fast. But the affectation was not only on the forests. They in many instances, the plant hunters also pay with their lives. It was not an easy job. The medicine was precarious. The conditions of life for people living in Europe was precarious. For people, there was the normal way of living. And many of them died, like Henry Chesterton, that was abandoned when he was sailing by the Magdalena River. The colleagues of the boat, just the other people on the boat, only put him on the bank. The Albert Millikan was killed, stabbed 14 times to death, and is now buried in La Victoria Caldas. So many collectors of plants, hunters of plants, died in very strange circumstances. For example, Karl Lehmann, he was a German, and he got married with the daughter of the president of Colombia back then, Tomás Cipriano de Mosquera, and he mysteriously drowned in the Timbiquí River, apparently for political reasons. So there are a lot of mini soap operas here, like a kind of a lot of tragedy in the action of collecting plants. In any case, so besides that, because remember, this was already a business that started at the end of the 1850s and take off in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. So what happened? All these plant hunters went to Colombia, to the mountains of the Andes of Ecuador, or the rivers, the cloud forest, and they sent the plants, that the plants arrived in Europe. But that was not, it was a simplistic way of seeing that. They were not just going there and collected the plants, because basically at least at the beginning of all this period of the market, many plants die. So Benedict Roosevelt, or I don't know the pronunciation, he mentioned how he sent 10,000 individuals of Anectochilus and a lot of also individuals of 3,000 of Odontoglossum to Medellin. It was in the mid-19th century, but he observed how only few passed to the West Indies, and then only really few plants arrived safely in England. So all this cutting of trees, collection, extractivism of plants, of orchids and thuriums and other plants, was basically had a very, very low rate of plants surviving and actually reaching Kew or other nurseries. So how plants were sent is very important, and because many of the plants, as I mentioned before, were sent in guardian cages. When plants were sent in guardian cases, they were kind of surviving, many of them, but that was not the case usually, because they were not available, or simply the plants being transported in these guardian cases were not suitable for this way of transporting. So what happened is that many plants were basically sent to Europe in the primigenic guardian case, which is the seed. So this is an example. Jamerson, I don't remember, Jamerson, sent seeds of iridaceous plants and cactus from the valley or Guayabramba in close to Ecuador. So a lot of plants were sent via seeds, but many of them die. And also, and this is quite important for understanding this mobility of plants I'm studying, many plants were sent in what they call dry boxes. Dry boxes were a mechanism that the plant hunters use to send plants from the forest to England without using soil. And why we didn't use soil was because most of these plants were epiphytes, plants that they were not actually living in the soil. And this is important because most of the history of the so-called orchid hunters have been focused on the people, on the market, but not in the plants by themselves. And here we see like an example from someone that sent some plants from Panama in a small dry box, and some people, when they arrived at Kew, wrote down that these kind of two species you see here were mostly dead, and they were mostly dead because these two were the only ones growing on soil. The others were epiphytes, and this basically that the people could transport plants that kind of survive, although we already saw that few survive, was change the market because basically the nature of the species allowed them to be transported. And then we have the epiphytes, the so-called air plants that have this possibility of being translated, transported like that, but also, and this is significant, they had a very flush flowers, flamboyant colors, different shapes. And here we have the orchids, anthuriums, and other kind of types like ripsalis, which is like a epiphyte cactus. So having this kind of a biological property allow them to transport these plants. And once the plants came to Europe, many of them survived. Now the nurseries, they could sell the plants, and they produce this kind of fine catalogs, very nicely designed, in which they sold the plants. This is from William Bull, one of the main figures. But it was like the big market, not only orchids, but many other plants. But orchids were kind of the main, the star of this, and they reached kind of a very astronomical prices, to the extent that many of them, as many of you might know, they were sold through auctions in central London. And people kind of pay quite a lot of money to have these plants, because these plants were used as a sign of ostentation. Imagine the price of sending someone, if the price of these plants needs to reflect the economic effort made by the nurseries that involve sending someone to Latin America, send a lot of plants, and keep them alive later in the nurseries. In any case, this is after all this process, the plant hunters, the dying plants, the plants becoming an object on the catalogs. We have another element that create or boosted this market of mainly orchids, but not necessarily, which is the hybridization process. And this started by John Dominy in 1856, when John Harris, which was a physician for Exeter and a dilettante, aficionated to botany, told him about the possibilities of creating new hybrids of orchids. So he successfully got a hybrid of plants. And then in this point, the hybridizers, people at Kew, but in the nurseries, start to produce plants that were not in nature. So they extracted from the diversity of plants in the wild certain ones with the desired characteristics, and they start to stretch the definition of a species. And this was significant and very important in the market because gave new varieties and rare plants not in the market, but also have a very significant consequence in terms of biology because of the idea of a species. And the most remarkable example of this is Odontoglossum crispum. Now people is working on that. A colleague, Camilo Uribe in Coventry, is working on that. And you see they have a lot of varieties. All these are the same kind of plant, but different varieties. Many of them created. So they took plants like, this is another example, a Cattleya tenai, which is like the national flower of Colombia. And you see they produce a lot of varieties. And this is from a notebook in Kew that someone took a lot of time cutting all the varieties of every plant that we knew was created in the 19th century. And what you see closely, you see that every plant, in this case the Cattleya, have a variety and a description and the place where the plant was created. So the plant basically was kind of created. So we have a lot of diversity there. But, and I say this before, orchids have been the center of attention, but they were not the only ones whatsoever. You see here in this cover of Benjamin Williams, another very important nursery man, that you have orchids, but you have different ones. And the diversity is quite impressive. They saw Aristolochias, a very interesting plant from a biological perspective. It's had a very strong coevolutive links with flies and also the Effenbachias because of the variegated, the colorful leaves, palms, and even trees like this Gustavia and a very beautiful tree present in the Andes, which it's quite big. So importantly, many of these plants, they were introduced to Europe, but they basically died because it was impossible to keep them alive when they grew. But many of them stay, and how they stay, it's a history of kind of architecture, the combination of many technology that came to keep these plants brought to England by the nurseries, by the hand of plant hunters and local people in Latin America. And these are the greenhouses, convent, the conservatories, stove houses. And this, it's important because at the beginning of this, I presented you this big greenhouse of Kew where plants were kind of a public space. But now, because people wanted to have these plants as a sign of ostentation, they start to acquire these kind of greenhouses. The greenhouses have been kind of exclusive for the nurseries. So every time one of these plant hunters sent a plant to London or to Edinburgh, they put the plant there and they have different kinds for specific types, for amaryllis, for orchids, for meat-eater carnivorous plants. But then this became popular, the prices drop a bit again, and then the most wealthy people on the on the British society managed to acquire this kind of artificial atmosphere artifacts, their greenhouses, and they have then they use them as a sign of ostentation. So not only having a very expensive cattleya was seen by these members of the elite as a sign of their social position, but also having this kind of a structure attached, mainly attached to your house. And therefore, you find a lot of images of these people being portrayed in their greenhouses. In this particular case, the woman you see here is not only surrounded by plants, many of them introduced from Latin America, but also the plants are in the fabric form of her dress. We have the king. The king is I think it's this Edward, and posing here. We might think this is a outdoor, but not. This is a greenhouse as well. So it was very popular, and there were many. There were conservatories, forcing houses for fruits, orchard houses only for pineapples, for vines, stop houses, very important for keeping plants for tropical environments alive in England. And with that, what we had is like public greenhouses like the one at Kew, but also private spaces, managed to keep all the diversity of the mountains. This is the Chimborazo painted by Humboldt, in one space or in different kind of spaces. If you were very rich, you could have plants from all the spectrum, all the mountains at home, which is basically what happened when you visit Kew today and you visit one of different kind of greenhouses or stuff called the palm house. So this was remarkable because they mixed plants from the Andes with plants from Himalaya, the Indian plants meet with the other plants. So this was kind of a small Pangeas living here in London and in England. But to keep these plants alive, they need to consume a lot of energy because they need to boil water to keep this warm environment. So they use a lot of coal. That means a lot of hydraulic technology was involved. So this history that started in the remote areas of Colombia or in other tropical environments derivate or progress towards like the knowledge on a hydraulic knowledge. So plumbers were involved because you need to have flowing water all the time, but also involved a network that kind of create or recreate this artificial environment and allow the owners of these spaces to have, for example, manure from different areas, but also guano from Peru and coconut fibers to grow the epiphytes. Remember, the epiphytes were growing on trees, and now they couldn't just put the plants on the soil, so they put it in another kind of fibers. Also, they have pests, so they create very particular elements specifically for the greenhouses, like the thanatophoro. That means that it brings death, and also then they have like architecture firms working particularly in designing greenhouses for these people. In any case, by the end of the 19th century, the trend of building greenhouses and introducing plants start to fade, collapse, mainly because of William Robinson. Maybe many of you know him, was a big figure by the end of the 19th century, and he started to be very critical with this idea of bringing plants that are like rare, exotic, when you could have plants more adapted to the reality, to the climatic reality of the UK. And then this ended up initially first by the war, this idea of beauty was completely transformed. And then the big nurseries that have been trading plants like beige or bull, beige closed, and then Sutton and other big nurseries emerged as nurseries for seeds for food. Later, a little bit later, the suffragans also put the cross on many orchids when they went to Kew and just destroy so many orchids as a way of political protest, because there have been plants, these plants have been used for a sign of elitism. So this is more or less the part that cover what I'm studying of this flow of plants from Latin America, specifically from the tropical Andes to England. But what happened in that place of the world where all these plants were extracted? What was the process there? Because it's kind of different. I forgot to mention that many plants from the Andes were still are around here, although many plants just disappeared. But now, coming back to what I was saying, so many plants, what happened there in Colombia and Ecuador. So I'm studying this process in the other direction, and for that I'm focusing my research into mainly two cities. One is Bogota, the capital of Colombia, and another one is Quito. And the circumstances there were completely different. They were not the center of any empire. They were kind of still colonial cities, like rooted with an architecture and urban design rooted in the colonial times. And this is a particular case. For example, this is an image of Bogota in the kind of late 19th century. What you can see here is a city without nature. The streets are narrow, and there is no sign of green spaces. People went there. People, I don't know if you know, but after the independence of Spain, the definite independence of the 1820s, people start to move to travel there, including plant hunters, and they describe these two cities like convent-like. They were not places of ostentation. They were therefore they didn't have gardens. But that was not completely true. A lot of gardens there existed in domestic spaces because the architecture of the city was inherited from Spain, which was also informed by the Muslim, in which the domestic space was the center of the house, of life, and the center of the domestic space, namely the house, was the patio. In the patio, plants emerge as a kind of vernacular gardens, completely different to the gardens in England, which were basically a sign of wealthy. Here was a sign of private space, so we have a lot of gardens in places devoted to religious orders, like monasteries, convents, like this one, Claustro de la Concepción in Quito, where you can see, this is of course a later picture, but you see that plants are living there. Outside, there were not many plants. Plants were inside. And this is a picture of in the already 1920, but besides the people very happy because of the wedding, you can see plants living there. And some of these plants, when you see them with a botanical eye, you can see that they were not very distant to the plants used in England a little bit earlier. In any case, this was until the late 19th century, but then influenced by all the modernization of urban environments in France, specifically in France, but also in England, the elites from Colombia, from Ecuador, from all tropical environments, but also all Latin America and basically all the world, start to a process of modernization of their cities that involve the the jump of plants from the domestic space to the public space. And then we start to see gardens there. One particular case is this in Bogota, where the main square, La Plaza Central, in 1856 was the market. And by the end of the 19th century, the government, the local government, commissioned this guy, Casiano Salcedo, to produce a garden, and the outcome was this kind of garden. So what you see here is a lot of plants coming to exist together in the public space in Bogota. This is Bogota. And you might think, okay, Bogota, Quito, the tropical Andes are the most biodiverse place on Earth. So you assume that many of the plants used in the ornamentation of the city will come from around the cities. For example, this is a picture I took when I was exploring these areas, when I was a proper botanist. And you see here is a garden. It's a proper, let's say, a garden made by the hand of God. But it's like it's symmetrical, have colors, different shapes. But those plants were systematically ignored in favor of plants coming from the north side of the world. So if in England they were craving to have exotic plants from the tropical environments, in Colombia, specifically in the high altitude cities, they were craving to have plants from Europe. And then a new actor emerged, which is the plant merchant. The plant merchant was someone working also for a nursery, but not going to collect plants in the wild, but to sell plants. And they were quite active selling plants. One of the most important, at least in Colombian Ecuador, was not from England, but from New York, the nurseries of Rochester, that they also produce a lot of catalogs, and they sent people that actually lobbied, did lobby in the local estaments to force the people to buy plants. So when they were kind of pushing mayor of Bogota by the end of the 19th century, Casiano Salcedo, say that this was not very convenient because the plants brought from Paris were cheaper than those bought from New York. So imagine the elites in Colombia, they didn't want to produce a city, a modern city, inspired by the promenades, the boulevards, and the parks of England or France, but they also wanted to have the plants. It's like they wanted to build buildings using bricks coming from abroad. So, and what the outcome of this is like the homogenization of the gardens in more or less all the places in contact with this trade of merchants and plant hunters. One kind of evident example, something you can see from pictures, is the systematic use of certain plants like the Araucaria heterophylla and many other, like the monkey puzzle here, that became kind of elements to create the parks. But also other people brought plants in Colombia. This is very difficult to track the introduction of plants there because we didn't have an institution like Kew, which was in the heart of the British Empire. But you go there to the archives and you start to retrieve some information. And what I have found is like many diplomats were also involved in introducing plants from the USA, but also from from Europe. They wanted to recreate their places, their home. They introduce a lot. Every time you read these introductions of diplomats, they introduce a lot of wine, and sometimes they introduce plants. So this idea that we see in the in the scholars that the guardian cases were always used to expand the power of the empire. It's true, but these cases also travel in other directions to introduce plants in other different regions of the world. And this is the example of Ecuador, which is more or less the same as Bogota. At the beginning, they have eucalyptus, but then they move and produce kind of European-like gardens with different spaces. This is a map of Quito, and they wanted this place here, which it was called the Alameda, to be a small piece of Versailles. So this idea of bringing plants from Europe to create European-like spaces was very common in all Latin America, but it was particularly possible in cities like Quito or Ecuador because the high altitude. And that the same has happened in Buenos Aires or in Santiago de Cuba, in Santiago de Chile. But many people were involved, especially in Quito, one French gardener that was involved in producing these European-like gardens. So I'm just kind of discovering who was involved here. And then again, the merchants, particularly the Rochester plant merchant that also sold a lot of plants in the creation of the Alameda Park in Quito. But of course, it's impossible to think that in the creation of a garden in these cities, only plants from Europe were used. It's ecologically and economically impossible. So in the end, what we had there is the same as we had here, is a mixagination, a combination, a mixture of plants coming from Europe, other natives that proved to be also good, that they planted once and died, but then try again and again, like a kind of experiment, and they managed to make of these plants kind of domestic ornamental plants. So we have the same, and we have this kind of variety that enrich deeply the flora of urban spaces in tropical environments. They, by themselves, they are very rich, but now with this idea modernization, the role of diplomats, of members of the elite, plants, urban environments in tropical cities became even richer. And then we have all this idea of the spaces, control spaces, that, and I'm almost done, ended up having a very particular consequences, which I address in my book, which is they use these gardens as a way of discipline, as a way of creating good citizens. So in summary, we have that, okay, and these of course have a very large consequences in terms of plants that became invasive in Europe, in Latin America, especially around Bogota or Quito, plants that were introduced as a way, as ornamental plants. So we have here, like what I'm proposing is like, we have a continuation of the Columbian exchange, which was kind of well described by Alfred Crosby. This idea that in the 16th century, or not idea, that this exchange of plants, that some plants from Europe moved to Latin America from the Neo-Europes, but some others traveled there to Europe. So the tomato, the onion, all the things that you might know. But what I'm arguing here is that the expansion of the urban life create the possibilities of a new exchange of plants that was like boosted by the expansion of capitalism, that had different roots in both sides. In Latin America, the introduction of plants was promoted by the desire of look or seem modern and have a modern environment. On the other hand, the the movement of plants in England or in Europe in general was propelled by this desire of the elites of showing, of having elements of ostentation. And very particular, if you compare these things, these two elements of these two spaces, well, you see that while in Europe, the plants at the beginning, the exotic plants were in the public space, like Kew, and then moved to the private space. In Latin America was the opposite. Initially, the plants were in the patios, in the private space, and then with the modernization of the cities, the plants jumped to the public space. So in any case, they were kind of different processes. This is what I'm studying. But what I also argue is this process was ephemeral because plants were introduced and many die. And in the end, not all the tropical plants resist for many generations to stay here in England. And the same in Latin America, many plants that were introduced, they are not there anymore, only with some exceptions that became, of plants that became invasive species. So this is the book that in which I'm going to expand a little bit, just a little bit about the creation of these gardens in tropical environments. And that's everything I wanted to share with you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diego. That was absolutely amazing sort of journey through continents and oceans and so on. So if you have questions for Diego, feel free to use the reaction button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, and I will invite you to unmute and ask your question. Or you may type your question into the chat box and I'll relay it to Diego. So while people are gathering their thoughts, I love that photo you put up of all the nuns in their courtyard in this very sort of lush surrounding with the gardens. I was just wondering whether the nuns and the monks were just cultivating gardens, or were they involved in botanical activities?
They definitely were involved in botanical activities because, for example, in Quito, one of the main claustros, the convents, had like at least 6 courtyards, backyards, in which in one they produce gardens, but on the other they grow barley and wheat for producing beer. Actually, the first beer in America was produced in Quito in one of these convents. So they had a lot of knowledge of how to grow plants that they were not native from that soil. But also, and this is kind of important and is very understudied, is the fact that nuns and priests have the largest mobility in the colonial time. In the colonial period, they were moving all from Cuba, Jamaica, Spain, and they keep introducing plants, but we don't have any idea. We only have some pictures, some notions, some plants that shows gardens, but there is no evidence because of the same nature of how these institutions, religious institutions, work very close to the outside world, because it's a closed cluster. But yes, they were definitely involved in different kind of, not necessarily and always ornamental perspective of manipulation of plants, but also in the kind of edible plants or medicinal plants. So yes, that's definitely something we don't know, and we need to know kind of more about this.
Did they keep written records that have survived, the monks and nuns?
I think in some ones they keep, but it's very difficult. For example, I tried to do that for the nuns, and because I was a man, a young man, kind of young, I was unable to go inside. So they didn't allow me to go inside because, yeah, the nature of this space that
Of
So for
course.
sure, but they are very like jealous with their very close with also with the archives, which are very, very, very good in at least in Colombia.
And could you elaborate a bit more? You're talking about gardens to discipline and to encourage good citizenship at the very, very end. You just sort of
Yeah, yeah.
tantalizingly mentioned that and moved on. So could you elaborate a bit more on this link between gardening and good citizenship?
That was something very common in the second half of the 19th century. So with these ideas of the bad airs that came from the medicine, the ideas of the body and the airs and how the disease was transmitted, when orphans or ill people or criminals were put in kind of these discipline spaces, they need to have a lot of green spaces because plants produce good airs, and producing good airs, the body, these good airs would tonify the body, but because the differentiation between body and moral behaviors was not clear, was not that different, there was not a difference between these two categories there. The green spaces in orphanages or in lunatic asylums promote the a good citizens, promote healthy citizens, but also promote people that through the cultivation of plants acquire disciplines. And in the picture I sent by the end, this is the San Jose orphanage, which was also created by Casiano Salcedo. And the level of sophistication of these gardens were unparalleled in Bogota. The paradoxical thing is those gardens were made by orphans that didn't have any house or any other space. And we have different examples like that in the jungle when they create jails, prisons in the jungle. So they try to promote the creation of gardens to make the inmates have another activity that allow them to kind of reintegrate themselves into the confidentiality of society. So yes, it's the gardens were actually all my research is the idea of power is there, an idea of the subtle uses of gardens that we have everywhere throughout the history.
Yeah. It sounds very constructive given the news that has come out about Wandsworth Prison here
Yeah,
in the past, about what they get up to
yeah.
them. We should introduce I think implicit in sort of the first part of your paper, but you didn't really explicitly address it. I was wondering what points of contact there were between sort of post-colonial approaches and decolonization approaches and your research.
Like the research that has been doing recently.
Well, you talk about sort of the plant hunters, which we
Yeah.
know about how they stripped things out and the destruction and so on. It was that first part of your paper that I was thinking about, that you didn't really sort of engage with any of the debates on sort of the post-colonial approaches to this type
No.
of career. I was just wondering, is it something that doesn't really interest you,
Yeah, of
or?
course, it's there. It's basically
Mm.
how these people made invisible all the local knowledge. Of course, it's implicit in what I'm saying, but yes, definitely, this is an imperial imperial machine that was putting all these plant hunters there, and the local people were invisible. But the plant hunters were also invisible when the plants came to Europe. They were also just pieces of this big market, to the extent that many of them were used by the nurseries. But yes, definitely, the important thing here, or what I'm kind of implying, is that the British in expansion was very evident in regions like India or in Barbados or in Australia, where they have direct contact. But in Latin America, there was a soft power. And they didn't have to put a lot of effort, actually, to go control resources there, because people were really keen to look like the people in the UK, or behave like them, help them. So there's a lot of through this history of plants, there is a lot of elements to debate around the soft power of the empire. The elites in Latin America, they were very welcoming with everything coming from England or from France. But of course, the elites were white people descended from Spain, and we have this invisible role of the blacks, the indigenous. We basically don't know anything about how they perceive, for example, the sense of beauty, which is something that I would love to explore, but because it's a historical research and they didn't leave any kind of record, I cannot grasp the idea of beauty, because this idea of having orchids in England was one thing, but maybe for them was kind of absurd. It was something like, but yes, it's of course there's, through these ideas of, through these kind of movements of plants, there are a lot of windows we can explore these topics through the kind of current post-colonial approach.
We've got some questions coming through on the chat. I think because we were just talking about citizenship a couple of minutes ago, maybe I'll take the second of these first. Agnieszka is asking, she says, thank you for a stimulating presentation. Could you expand on the notion of citizenship in the context of universities, their design and planting?
Can you repeat that question? The citizenship?
Could you expand on the notion of citizenship in the context of universities, their design and their planting? So I'd imagine, you know, planting and urban design, the role that planting plays in the urban design of the universities. Agnieszka, feel free to come in if you would like to sort of elaborate on your question. Do unmute and come in. And maybe she doesn't want to.
Okay, it's fine.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in the universities. There, I don't know.
There she is, Agnieszka. Let me do you need me to unmute you?
Yep, she's frozen.
I'm just going to ask her to unmute. But she's frozen. Agnieszka, you've frozen. I think your internet connection has frozen.
Yes,
Maybe
yes, I'm here.
Oh, yes, there she is. You froze for a moment. So if you were explaining something, we've just missed it.
Yes, I was fascinated by the idea of planting and involving different groups of people, the orphans or the incarcerated people. What about planting the universities? Because we know that in India, for example, in Udaipur, many campuses today, students with not only planting, but also with conservatories, and introducing students to that sort of industrial area. World in Colombia. I know nothing about it.
We lost you repeatedly there when you were talking about India because of your web connection. But Diego, did you get enough of the context that she wanted you to tease out?
So, yes. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly, but what I know is that campuses in Latin America, they came very late They were basically product of the 1930s, 1920s. This is in the 20th century already. And they were not made particularly part of this big process I'm studying. So I don't know. But what I know, it's like the campus where I study in Medellin. It's a huge campus produced by the Rockefeller family. They gave us the money. It's a very beautiful campus full of ornamental plants from tropical environments. So I guess there was an idea there to produce plants, to produce spaces with native species. And if you go, for example, to La Universidad de La Habana in Cuba, in La Habana, Cuba, it's completely astonishing what they have there. This mix between plants and buildings that also happen because of the abandonment of the buildings. But in that side of the world, of course, I don't know because it's quite late. But what I know, and actually I studied today, I was in Q, is that they have Q was working as a kind of a university. So Q was not just a garden, but they call it alma mater as well. They call it the alma mater, which is like the place you study. So, and in that case, they have a lot of resources to have a lot of plants. If the plants in the universities were used with another kind of idea, political idea, or something like I was mentioning before, it's something I don't really know, and I doubt, because this is already another moment of the history of science where we already knew that plants, of course, were good, but they didn't make people better.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I'm sorry.
What about the role of universities in terms of the history of botany as an academic discipline?
Oh, this is it's also coming from the 20th century. Is something I am more familiar with. Universities, we didn't have many. We have all schools. But most of the evolution of botany came from the early 20th century and was possible not because of the connections between United Kingdom and Latin America, but the connections with the new empire, the new center of the empire, which was United States. But that doesn't mean people were not studying plants. We had a lot of history of people studying plants since the late 18th century, when the King of Spain organized this La Expedición Botánica, the botanical expedition in Latin America, 4 expeditions, and that produced a lot of seeds, and people study botany in the schools and then in universities. And there is like a genealogy of botanists coming from the 18th century. So we are all part of this kind of pupil-like structure of the botanical teaching in Latin, at least in Colombia.
Thanks very much. Eleanor Gillespie has a question. Eleanor, do unmute and put your camera on if you would like to ask your question instead of me reading it. Are you there, Eleanor?
Yes, yeah. I can't get my video to come on because my Wi-Fi's not great. But
That's okay.
yeah, I really, really enjoyed your paper. I was just wondering, because you mentioned this shift kind of around the First World War towards, in Britain, more kind of practical uses for nurseries in terms of growing seeds and plants away from the ornamental plants. I was wondering whether this shifted back again after the First World War, or if it was a longer change in trends away from the kind of tropical ornamental plants.
I haven't explored what happened after the First War. The First War was like a watershed, you mentioned, you called it, something that transformed definitely the trade of plants, because during the First War, the transport of plants was banned, but also, and this is important, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but expanding about a little bit on this, is that all the infrastructure that had been established to feed this market disappear. There were not hunters traveling. Traveling was difficult. There was not market. And for example, who could afford to have a coal for burning and then in a greenhouse when people really need coal to burn their own houses? All the economic structure in which this exchange of plants, at least in England, was standing, disappear. And one clear example is that, and something I like and I would like to research more about, is how many nurseries that have been in the business of introducing, hybridizing, selling ornamental plants ended up supplying grasses to the army to create new, how you call this, paths where the planes land and take off, because at the beginning they were for that purposes. And then after the war, a new body, human body, emerged. This is not the body of coming from the romantic place, from the romantic time, in which is the beauty, and the plants produce health, but this is the body of the sports. And all these, many of the nurseries that had produced ornamental plants that moved during the war to produce grass for the landing space for planes, became the suppliers of Wimbledon grasses. So life changed this significantly during the 20th century. Population grew. It was another human body, and therefore our relationship with plants changed radically, with plants, with ornamental plants, radically changed, which is not something new. After the pandemic, we saw that. Now, I guess many of you guys over there have monsteras at home, but monsteras before the pandemic, nobody knew what a monstera was. And this is because we experienced something, world change, our body is different, the conditions are different, and then plants came in one way that were not basically the way we saw them before a war or before a pandemic. So never recover to the extent of that, to answer your question, Eleanor, but shifted to the extent that we are coming back to, again, to the ornamental tropical plants, but not now in greenhouses, but in tiny flats in central London with one glass, which is the only window you have, and not for wealthy people, but for the millennials.
Eleanor, did you want to come back, or did that answer?
No, I was just when you were talking about the kind of current trend for houseplants, I definitely thought of that when you were speaking about earlier on about the kind of plants as a kind of a sign of wealth and refinement, and you just think yeah, they're so prevalent again in the last couple of years. They've really taken off, and yeah, it's interesting. We probably aren't all growing them in probably the environments they really need, because we haven't got them in little greenhouses.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Eleanor. Does anyone else have a question? I was curious because I've never been to Colombia. The photos that you put up of the plazas and the public gardens, they look so European. Do they still exist? Because those were obviously quite old photos that you put up. I was wondering, do they still exist, and do they still exist in that form? Or have they made them look more Colombian in the meantime?
No, but the self idea of a Latin American city is a European creation. All the Tenochtitlan, all the cities that existed there were devastated by the Spaniards. So we don't really have a urban image of the pre-Columbian space. So everything is basically European. And they exist, of course, those are the symbolic centers of every city. But in big cities like Bogota, like all the capitals, the main square was a garden for 50, at least 40 years. And then when the cars came, they just came back to the just round, very gray surface. And never again they hosted plants. So now, still, of course, the plazas exist. They are the most important place when you want to overthrow a government, when you want to make a protest, is in the central plaza. So that's why planting gardens there for many liberal people, what you call today progressives people, were seen as a sign of disengage with the political speech and political manifestation. So yes, no, the plazas are there, but without a single shade of coming from a tree.
Wow, you need them to stage coups.
Yeah. Yes.
Does anyone else have a question for Diego? He had put his email address up on his last slide, so you can always get in touch with him if something occurs to you later on. If not, I'd just like to thank you so much, Diego. That was absolutely amazing. You've really seen us out with a bang.